It was National Day, coinciding with my 5th wedding anniversary with my wife, Elizabeth. We had planned to travel to the Aegean Sea for the holiday together, but on the morning of our departure, Elizabeth hurriedly packed her luggage and told me, "The company needs me for a last-minute business trip." I believed her, until late at night, when I saw a tweet from Elizabeth's first love, Gabriel. In the photo, the two of them were intimately close, fingers tightly intertwined, wearing matching couple bracelets that stood out brightly. I forced a smile. She did go to the Aegean Sea after all, but the person she went with wasn't me. I didn't call to confront her. I simply liked the tweet. A minute later, Elizabeth nervously called me. "It's a misunderstanding. We just happened to bump into each other while on business. I promise I'll make it up to you next year for National Day." I sneered. "It's fine. Hope you enjoy yourself." Elizabeth, puzzled, asked, "Why aren't you jealous this time?" Chapter 1. Elizabeth returned a week later. When she walked in, dragging her large suitcase behind her, I used to always rush to take it from her and help her change into slippers, but this time, I didn't. Elizabeth leaned against the door, frowning as she looked at me. "Martin, where are my slippers?" In the past, every time she came home, I would have her slippers neatly placed, waiting for her, but this time, I hadn't. Seeing me sit motionless on the couch, watching TV, she asked, "They're in the shoe cabinet. You can look for them yourself." Elizabeth's frown deepened at my response, but after a moment of hesitation, she relaxed and went to the shoe cabinet herself. She put on her slippers and came up to me. Looking at the empty dining table, she pouted, "I'm a bit hungry. Can you make me some dumplings?" Usually, if she was hungry, I'd get up in the middle of the night to make her noodles, but today, I simply replied, "I'm busy. Order takeout if you're hungry." A look of displeasure crossed Elizabeth's face as she sighed and came closer, softening her tone. "Honey, I know the business trip upset you. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. I brought you a gift. Please forgive me." I remained unfazed, my tone calm. "You're overthinking it. I'm not upset." Elizabeth blinked, confused, then frowned. She took out a poorly wrapped gift from her suitcase. When she opened it, it was a tie. With an expectant look on her face, she said, "Do you like it? I specially picked it out for you." I remembered a tweet Gabriel had posted 3 days ago, a promotional event for a mall opening during National Day, offering a free tie for purchases over 10,000 yuan. That same blue-green tie was now being presented to me as a thoughtful gift from Elizabeth. I didn't let my dissatisfaction show, accepting the gift and saying calmly, "Thanks, it's very thoughtful." When she saw I had no other words, Elizabeth seemed surprised. "Is that all?" I gave a brief, and asked, "What else do you want to hear?" Elizabeth frowned, holding my arm, explaining, "Are you still upset? I already told you. Gabriel and I just ran into each other while on business. We only had a meal together at the airport." I nodded. "I know. I'm not upset." My lack of reaction seemed to catch her off guard. She stared at me in disbelief. "Why aren't you jealous this time?" "There's nothing to be jealous about. I've gotten over it." I stood up and grabbed my coat, preparing to leave. Once again, Elizabeth stepped in front of me, blocking my path, and asked, "Where are you going?" "What about my anniversary gift?" A month ago, I had won a blue gemstone bracelet at an auction, and Elizabeth had seen the news about it. Unexpectedly, I picked up my phone and transferred her 30,000 yuan, replying, "I forgot to prepare it. Here's the money, buy whatever you like." Elizabeth immediately fell silent. For 5 years of marriage, I had always carefully prepared gifts for her during every holiday without fail. She froze for a few seconds, then angrily grabbed my hand and asked, "What about the bracelet?" I sneered, pointing at her wrist. "What bracelet? Isn't that a couple bracelet you're wearing with Gabriel?" Elizabeth suddenly looked very awkward. "This. He just gave it to me as a friend. Don't think too much about it. I'll take it off right now." Having lived together for 5 years, I was very familiar with her micro-expressions. From the way she clenched the corner of her shirt, I could tell she was flustered. Since I had already lost all hope, I didn't want to say another word to her. I pinched the bridge of my nose, exhausted, and turned to leave. Chapter 2. After 5 years of marriage, I had always put Elizabeth first. It had been a long time since I'd seen my old friends, so I bought a plane ticket to Hong Kong and decided to meet up with my brothers. As soon as my good friend Mario received my call, he immediately arranged a dinner for us. After several rounds of drinks, everyone stared at me for a moment before almost simultaneously saying, "We thought once you got married, you'd forget about us, but does Elizabeth know you're here?" I took a couple of sips of my drink and smiled. "From now on, you can call me anytime." No need to get her approval. My phone screen kept flashing with calls from Elizabeth, over a dozen in total. Ever since Gabriel came back to the country, there had been several times when Elizabeth stayed out all night, and I would make the same frantic calls to her. There were times when I angrily questioned why I couldn't reach her, and she'd impatiently reply, "Is the sky falling? Every time I see you repeatedly calling, it disgusts me." Now, She had become the one causing the disgust. We continued drinking and socializing late into the night. As the party was winding down, Elizabeth hurriedly pushed the door open and entered. She pulled out a chair and naturally sat next to me, snatched my glass of wine, and said, "You shouldn't drown your sorrows in alcohol. Don't you know your stomach can't handle it?" For a moment, I was caught off guard. Her sudden concern felt southwest out of place. I raised my eyes to glance at her, my tone cold. "What are you doing here?" My brothers greeted her politely, and after she responded with a smile, she tightly grasped my hand and whispered, "You wouldn't answer my calls, so I had no choice but to come find you." I angrily pulled my hand away and coldly replied, "Elizabeth, I've told you before, we have nothing to do with each other anymore. Please don't overstep." Elizabeth stared at me, stunned. I pulled my brothers aside and walked past her. She ran after us, shouting at my back, "Martin, I've already come to make it up to you. What more do you want me to do? We're almost 30 years old, and you still run off whenever we argue. Can't you be more rational?" Elizabeth quickly got into a car and followed me to Mario's house. In the car, she tried again to talk, but I firmly rejected her. She seemed angry and embarrassed, saying, "Enough with the drama, enough drinking. Come home with me, please. I know you're jealous, but Gabriel and I are completely innocent. Why hurt your body like this?" I smiled and replied, "You're mistaken. I'm drinking because I'm happy to see my brothers, not because of anything else." With that, I pushed her aside and grabbed Mario, heading straight for home. No matter how hard she knocked on the door, I ignored her. That night, I slept soundly. Chapter 3. The next morning, Mario knocked on my door and told me that Elizabeth had arrived. I got dressed and walked downstairs, where I saw Elizabeth sitting at the dining table, her face dark and silent. I knew she was angry. In the past, if she even furrowed her brow, I'd immediately rush over to cheer her up. But this time, I didn't even look back as I walked out the door. Hailing a cab on the street, at the airport lounge, I ran into Elizabeth again. She walked up to me, her voice full of anger. "Martin, we're married. You don't need to avoid me over something so small." I didn't lift my head. Still tapping on the keyboard, I replied, "You're overthinking. I'm not avoiding you." Just as I finished speaking, Elizabeth's phone rang, and I heard Gabriel's voice through the screen. "Where are you? Don't forget the party tonight. Whether we sign the deal depends on today." Since Gabriel divorced and returned to the country 3 years ago, Elizabeth had frequently helped him behind my back, using me as an excuse. I thought I could turn a blind eye to it, but when I saw the smile curling on her lips, I felt a sharp sting. That soft tone of hers had never been given to me. Most of the time, when she spoke to me, it was always in a businesslike tone. I had asked her before to be more gentle with me. She would always respond impatiently, "The company's problems already stress me out. Can you stop having so many demands?" Thinking of this, I immediately lowered my head and sent 2 messages to my secretary, instructing him to inform our business partners that Elizabeth and I were in the process of getting a divorce. After the call ended, she turned to look at me, immediately wiping away her sweet smile. "There are company matters to handle. The flights have all been booked, so you'll have to give me your ticket. You can take the next one." When I remained unmoving, she repeated herself. I coldly responded, "I didn't buy a return ticket to B-City." Upon hearing that, Elizabeth was enraged. "Martin, so all of this was just a show? You came to the airport just to tell me you're jealous, right? You're so childish." With that, Elizabeth turned and stormed off. I watched her walk away, a wave of bitterness rising in my chest. No matter the time or place, whenever Gabriel called, Elizabeth would drop everything and rush to him. Just like the tweet he posted on New Year's Eve, "True favoritism means she always chooses you, no matter what." Chapter 4. I didn't buy a return ticket to B-City because my destination was Spain. After taking over Foo's company, my top priority was entering the supermarket business, and the land in the western suburbs was the most suitable location at the moment. Mario recommended a mentor to me, claiming that he was a close friend of his father's. All I had to do was have a meal with him, and I'd learn a lot. We hit it off immediately, and during the meal, the mentor helped me clarify many of my current concerns. He took a liking to me and suggested I stay to learn at his company for 6 months. He promised that after that, I'd be able to successfully enter the supermarket business and make a name for myself. The opportunity was right in front of me, and I had no reason to refuse. After the meal, just as I was about to take the mentor back to his place, Elizabeth's calls flooded in. I impatiently hung up several times, until the mentor spoke up. "Do you need to inform your family about your trip to Spain?" He must have seen the affectionate nickname I had for Elizabeth in my phone. I shook my head and explained, "That was for my former spouse. I've already decided to divorce her." After sending the mentor to his destination, I finally returned Elizabeth's call. As soon as she picked up, Elizabeth directly asked, "Martin, what do you mean by this? Why did the partners tell me today that they only want to meet with you about the collaboration? What's going on?" Haven't I been handling all the company's affairs for these years? Do you know how important tonight's collaboration is to me? Listening to her usual commanding tone, I couldn't help but laugh. So what? Just then, I heard Gabriel's voice on the other end. Elizabeth, you have to help me with this. You're my only hope. Elizabeth softly reassured him. Don't worry, I've got this. I clenched my fist and slammed it hard on the steering wheel, a surge of hatred rising in my chest. Elizabeth insisted there was nothing between them, yet she spoke to him so tenderly in front of me. When did Elizabeth start wearing this mask of fake affection when dealing with me? It was revolting. I coldly rejected her and hung up the phone, turning it off. Chapter 5. I stayed in Spain for 2 days. Aside from having tea and deep conversations with the mentor, I also completed the formalities for my new job and found accommodation near the company. I had my assistant inform a few business partners about my trip abroad and took the opportunity to thank them for their support over the years. At home, there were no signs of Elizabeth's return. Everything was as usual. I took the chance to change the front door's password. After taking a day to rest, the business partners called one by one, insisting on organizing a farewell banquet for me. I couldn't turn them down, so I had to attend. The door to the private room was slightly ajar, and I could hear Gabriel chatting with the partners inside. I was suspicious. I hadn't expected Elizabeth and Gabriel to be invited to a simple farewell banquet. I hesitated for a few seconds but pushed the door open and walked in. Gabriel was sitting in the main seat, leaning against Elizabeth. When Elizabeth saw me, she looked up and said, "Everyone here is a friend, so just sit anywhere." The other night's banquet had some misunderstandings. Now that everyone is here, let's openly discuss anything that needs to be said. The partners all turned their eyes to me. When they saw my dark expression and my silence, they didn't say anything. Gabriel's eyes were full of smugness, and he smiled at me. I wasn't interested in sitting near them, so I casually pulled out a chair and sat down. Throughout the meal, Gabriel kept raising his glass to toast the partners, loudly discussing the bright future after the collaboration was signed. It was clear that he was in a very good mood tonight. My phone also kept flashing with messages. Elizabeth had sent me several. Later, I'm going to announce something, so give me some face. If you have any questions, we can discuss them at home. You should be able to see now that Gabriel and I have nothing to hide. No need for you to worry. I kept reading, and a new message popped up. Gabriel will probably get drunk tonight, so after the banquet, I might need to take him home first. I raised an eyebrow and briefly replied with, "Whatever." After several rounds of drinks, Elizabeth saw the mood was right, stood up with Gabriel, and announced, "From now on, Gabriel will be our company's newly appointed head. He'll be responsible for coordinating with all of you, so please give him your full support." At that moment, one of the business partners sitting closest to me looked puzzled and asked, "Coordinating? What coordinating? Foo's already decided to pull out of B-City. We're all prepared to withdraw our investment. Who are you coordinating with?" "What? Pulling out of B-City? Martin, you?" Elizabeth's face turned pale with shock. She quickly turned to me. I nodded indifferently. "Yes, I plan to move Foo's business overseas." Elizabeth's eyes widened, and her expression froze. "You're taking Foo's business overseas. What about me?" Chapter 6. I hadn't wanted to expose everything, thinking I could just finish the meal and end the evening on a good note. But I never expected that Elizabeth had called Gabriel for this purpose. What withdrawal? Why didn't I know about this? The business partner looked at me and then continued, "Didn't Mr. Fu tell you? This dinner is a farewell banquet. Who knows when we'll collaborate again?" Hearing this, Elizabeth stood up in a fury and stormed over to confront me. "Martin, what does that mean? Are you really going overseas?" I gave her a cold look, drained my glass, and stood up. "Thanks to everyone for your companionship over the years. If we have the chance, we'll meet again in the future." I turned to leave, but Elizabeth, with red eyes, grabbed my hand and shouted, "Say what you have to say before you go. When did you make this decision? Why am I only hearing about it now?" Her voice was trembling with anger and disbelief. I fought to hold back my anger and shook her hand off. "Enough. It's not too late to know now." My voice was cold. Seeing my impatience, Elizabeth grabbed the nearest bottle of wine and threw it at my face. I couldn't avoid it, and the bottle crashed heavily against my head. In an instant, blood poured from my wound. I fell straight to the ground, and Mario immediately rushed to shield me. Seeing my face covered in blood, Elizabeth seemed to panic. She hurriedly shouted, "Quick, call an ambulance." Everything before my eyes turned blurry. When I closed my eyes, I could hear people's anxious voices in my ears, but my eyelids felt as heavy as lead, and I couldn't lift them. I held on until we were outside the operating room. When the doctor asked the family to sign the consent form, I tugged on Mario's sleeve and said, You go sign it." Elizabeth, now frantic, walked up to my bed. "Martin, I'm your wife. In such an urgent situation, why are you still arguing with me?" I gently waved my hand and replied, "No argument." In my heart, You're already my ex-wife. Before I fell unconscious, I heard her voice trembling with hysteria. I haven't agreed to a divorce. I won't divorce you. Chapter 7. When I woke up again, I was lying in a hospital room, receiving in 4 drip. The white walls of the hospital made my eyes hurt. Elizabeth was holding my hand, fast asleep. Thinking about the look of rage on her face yesterday as she hurt me, I couldn't help but shiver. She slowly opened her eyes and asked, "How do you feel? Is there anywhere that's still uncomfortable?" Hearing her concerned tone, I looked at her with suspicion. It was her who caused all this harm to me yesterday, and now she was acting like she had no idea. I forcefully shook off her hand and turned my head, unwilling to say another word to her, but to my surprise, she smiled gently and cupped my face, softly saying, "Don't be angry. Last night, I got emotional and accidentally hurt you." I scoffed coldly and pushed her hand away again. Maybe she didn't even realize it, but I could still smell Gabriel's distinctive woody fragrance on her. The scent made me sick to my stomach. Elizabeth seemed to notice the disgust in my eyes. "Martin, what do I need to do to make things like before again? I was just on a business trip. You didn't have to make a big deal out of it, did you?" In the past, I always thought that as a married couple, we should maintain some face, but after Elizabeth repeatedly trampled on my dignity, I couldn't take it anymore. Elizabeth's phone flashed twice. She glanced at the messages, then smiled and sat by my bed, taking my hand in hers. Her tone shifted as she said, "Can you call the business partners? Gabriel really wants this project. We'll discuss your trip abroad later, but can you help him out for now? We shouldn't involve other people in our personal matters." I hadn't expected that after I made myself so clear that day, Elizabeth still thought I was just sulking. Frowning, I responded coldly, "I won't make the call. If you want to help him, you'll have to do it on your own." Before Elizabeth could get angry, my phone rang. It was the mentor asking if I had packed everything. I told him I had been injured unexpectedly and would have to delay for a week. He reminded me to take care and then hung up. Elizabeth looked at me in shock. "You've already made all the arrangements. You've even booked your ticket." Her voice trembled, mixed with a hint of fear. I realized and quietly murmured, My tone was distant and cold, and upon hearing it, Elizabeth's face turned ashen. "Martin, we're married. Do you remember you promised me that we would discuss everything together? Why are you making decisions on your own for something this big? You didn't even consult me." I forced a faint smile and responded, "Lately, you've been too busy going on trips and socializing with Gabriel, so I didn't have the chance to tell you." Listening to her words, I felt a mixture of emotions. When we got engaged, we promised each other to trust and discuss everything together, but since Gabriel's return, Elizabeth often stayed out all night and didn't let me ask questions. Every time I tried, she would scold me with an unhappy face. "I'm an adult. Do I really have to report to you about every little thing? Your controlling tendencies are too much." In the end, I could only learn about Elizabeth's whereabouts from Gabriel's Twitter. I never expected that she would still use our agreement to bind me, without a hint of shame. As soon as I finished speaking, the deliveryman walked in, holding a bouquet of sunflowers, the flowers I liked the most. Elizabeth looked a bit awkward, and I knew the bouquet wasn't from her. Coincidentally, Elizabeth had a habit of sending flowers to friends or family who were in the hospital. The moment I woke up, I looked around the room, and it was clear she hadn't shown any of that thoughtfulness toward me. After accepting the flowers, Elizabeth awkwardly smiled and said, "Mario really is thoughtful." A sour feeling filled my chest, and tears welled up in my eyes. The person I had treated like a treasure couldn't even compare to how much my brothers cared about me. How laughable. Chapter 8. I had my assistant deliver the divorce agreement, wanting to settle everything before I left for my overseas trip. The moment Elizabeth took the divorce papers, she tore them to shreds and threw them in my face. She didn't even bother to look at the terms. Furious, she snapped, "Martin, it's one thing to be jealous, but I hold many of the company's core secrets. If you want a divorce, think carefully about the consequences first. We've been married for 5 years. Some things can be worked through. I suggest you calm down and come find me later." With that, she turned and stormed off. Watching her furious back, I couldn't help but let out a deep sigh. I honestly didn't know why I had chased after her so relentlessly in the beginning. The first time I met Elizabeth was on the first day of university. She was standing at the school gate in a white dress, hesitating. I happened to pass by and she grabbed my arm. She cautiously asked if I could help her, as her suitcase was broken. I was captivated by the deep dimples at the corners of her mouth. Normally, I wasn't the type to help others, but that day, even though I was in a rush to the auditorium for rehearsal, I didn't hesitate to help her carry her luggage back to her dorm. She took out a package of local specialties from her suitcase as a thank you gift and asked for my contact information. Later, we both joined the student council and became closer. We would have meals together, watch movies, and study at the library. I noticed she often ate only vegetables and, not long after the semester began, She started looking for part-time jobs off campus. I couldn't help but ask if she was having financial difficulties. At first, she didn't want to tell me the truth about her family situation, but not long after, she came to me crying, asking to borrow money for her father's urgent surgery. Without hesitation, I transferred the money to her. From then on, I gave Elizabeth a supplementary card so she could live a little better. At first, she was reluctant to use my money, but later, when her father's injuries became more serious, she borrowed money from me twice and eventually began using my card regularly. Perhaps even she had gotten used to my support, which is why she became bolder, expecting me to help with everything she did. I could see that Elizabeth wouldn't divorce easily, but time wasn't on my side. That evening, I received a call from the property management. Elizabeth couldn't get into the house and had been arguing with them, even calling a locksmith. Phoo. I had told the property management days ago not to let Elizabeth enter my house. On the other end of the line, I could hear her shouting, "I'm the owner. Why can't I change the lock? You don't have the right to stop me." Hearing her shrill, combative voice, I rubbed my temples in frustration and decided to go back. I would also take the opportunity to discuss the divorce once more. By the time I reached the door, the police had already arrived. I was the one who called them. When Elizabeth saw me return, she grabbed my wrist and tried to justify herself. "He's my husband. We've just had some recent arguments. He secretly changed the password. He's been injured and is in the hospital. I didn't want to disturb him, so I called Phoo to change the lock." I frowned and impatiently interrupted her. "We're already in the process of getting divorced. We're no longer a couple. You have no right to enter my home, let alone change the locks." As soon as I finished speaking, Elizabeth flew into a rage. "This house is marital property. I have half ownership. You don't have the right to kick me out without a word. Did you forget what you promised me when we got engaged? You said everything you have is mine." I shook my head helplessly. "Elizabeth, I hope you understand. The reason I was willing to give you everything was because I loved you. But no one will tolerate repeated infidelity and still love you." After I spoke those words, Elizabeth's eyes reddened, and she grabbed my clothes, shouting, "I don't care. This is my home. You open the door now. I'm going to get my things." Originally, I had intended to set a time for her to pack up her things, but given the situation, I agreed. However, once she got inside, she immediately locked herself in her room and refused to move. I was getting frustrated and knocked on the door, reminding her, "I'll give you 3 hours. I need to go back to the hospital, so hurry up and pack your things." I sat quietly on the couch, and an hour later, the doorbell rang. I struggled to get up from the couch and opened the door to see Gabriel standing there. He was holding a transparent bag, inside of which was a pink rabbit ear pajama. He glanced behind me and asked, "Has Elizabeth come back?" I noticed a faint pink mark on Gabriel's neck and didn't feel like responding. I was about to close the door, but he stepped forward and stopped me. I suppressed my anger and asked, "What are you doing?" Gabriel smiled and handed me the bag. "This is something Elizabeth left in my suitcase the other day. I was worried she wouldn't find it, so I brought it over today on my way." Even though I had decided to completely end things with Elizabeth, seeing her intimate clothing in another man's suitcase still made me uneasy. I pointed behind me. "She's in her room. You can go up and take her now if you want to have a chat." At this, his smug expression faltered, and a look of guilt flashed in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. "Martin, don't misunderstand. Elizabeth and I are not like you think." Before he could finish, I shoved him aside and said, "I'm going back to the hospital. You should hurry up and take her with you." Just as I was about to close the door, Elizabeth ran over and shouted frantically, "Why do you have to be so harsh? I've explained it so many times. Gabriel and I have nothing going on. Why do you always have to be so aggressive? Martin, when you're discharged, we need to have a serious talk." The door slammed shut with a bang, and I pressed my lips tightly together, saying nothing. I called a cab and gave the driver the address for the hospital, closing my eyes in exhaustion. Chapter 9. I spent another 3 days in the hospital. What shocked me even more was that Elizabeth began driving 40 minutes every day to visit me in the hospital. She would stay all day, only leaving when the sun set. I asked her to leave, but she refused. "Martin, I'm doing this to show you that I really care about you. I don't want to be apart from you. I hope you'll reconsider going abroad." I called her crazy and accused her of not understanding a word I said, but Elizabeth still did as she pleased. In an attempt to stop her, I tried to communicate with the hospital to refuse her visits. However, the nurse informed me that Elizabeth hadn't been causing any disturbances, and she was allowed to visit me whenever she wished. I arranged for 2 security guards to stand outside my door, but when she couldn't get in, she called the police. After showing the police our marriage certificate, they gave us a few words of advice and told us not to waste public resources. Exhausted, I decided to give up the struggle and focus on recovering. Elizabeth mistakenly thought I might change my mind, and after that, she became even more desperate to show me how good she was. Chapter 10. To make it in time for my flight to Spain, I checked out of the hospital on the evening of the 6th day. Elizabeth had something to take care of, so she said she'd come later. When I got home, I was busy packing my bags and didn't notice my phone constantly flashing. It wasn't until Elizabeth angrily knocked on my door that I realized it was already quite late. I opened the door and shoved 3 large suitcases in front of her. Elizabeth, looking shocked, asked, "What is this supposed to mean?" I coldly replied, "I packed up all your clothes. Take them with you." Her face showed hesitation, and she stammered, "You went into my closet." I snorted and pointed to the suitcases. "I put your wooden box in there." In 5 years of marriage, I had never stepped into Elizabeth's closet, and I never knew she kept the wooden box in such a conspicuous place. Inside it was a yellowed diary, detailing how 18-year-old Elizabeth had felt about Gabriel. Every word was full of affection. The diary also contained a photo of Gabriel's profile, clearly kept with great care. Seeing my darkened expression, Elizabeth hurriedly explained, "Don't misunderstand. I haven't opened the box since it was placed there. Gabriel and we're not." "Enough, Elizabeth. I don't want to hear another word about you and Gabriel." I directly shoved her and the 3 suitcases out the door. That night, Elizabeth didn't leave, and I stayed in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the moonlight all night. I watched her downstairs and kept wondering, when did things between us change? Maybe it started when Gabriel and I both noticed the same watch. Elizabeth had told me the day before that she had bought the limited edition Maya watch, but when she returned from her business trip the next day, she claimed she hadn't been able to get it. When I pressed her about it, she impatiently told me, "I misspoke yesterday. I didn't get it after all." But how did that watch end up in Gabriel's hands? At his company's grand opening, everyone praised his incredible ability, even managing to acquire such a difficult-to-get watch. Elizabeth probably thought I didn't know about any of this, but ever since I decided to part ways with her, I had people investigating, though I had mentally prepared myself. When the evidence was laid out in front of me, my heart still hurt for a long time. At that moment, I suddenly felt thankful that Elizabeth and I didn't have any children. Over the past 5 years, at every social gathering, the topic of children always came up. Elizabeth would always say I was too busy with work and hadn't considered it yet. In front of everyone, I would always give her face and agree that it was indeed my fault. But deep down, Elizabeth knew that it was she who had always refused to have children with me. The diary said that she only wanted to have children with one person in her lifetime. I knew, in the end, I was never the one she truly wanted. Chapter 11. Before I left, I had the security guards escort Elizabeth, who had been sitting there all night, out of the building. As the car passed the security office, our eyes met. At that moment, I suddenly realized that the girl who used to stir my emotions with every frown and smile now looked so worn out that she couldn't make my heart ache even a little. So this is what it feels like to stop loving someone. Before the plane took off, I gave Elizabeth a big gift. I had my assistant deliver to her all the information I had gathered about Gabriel. This included details about Gabriel's affairs with 2 other women after returning to B City. Gabriel had always told Elizabeth that his divorce was because of his ex-wife's infidelity, but the unfaithful one wasn't his ex-wife. Gabriel had been using Elizabeth all along, slowly making her willing to open a company for him, bring in business, and even give herself up. I had a video call with Gabriel's ex-wife, who gave me a lot of evidence. She had one condition: she wanted to see Gabriel get the punishment he deserved. As the saying goes, if you want to keep something hidden, you must never do it yourself. Gabriel's company's finances had been in disarray for the past 2 years, so I reported him and also filed a lawsuit to demand that the money Elizabeth spent on his company be returned. After more than 10 hours of flying, I turned my phone back on, and it was flooded with unread messages. Most of them were from Elizabeth. I didn't respond to any of them. It was all over now. By now, Elizabeth should have seen the evidence and received the court summons. She was unwilling to sign, so I had no choice but to take the divorce to court. I successfully started working at my professor's company, and a month later, our divorce trial was scheduled. I had to go back once more. On the day of the trial, I saw Elizabeth, whose eyes were sunken and face dull. In just a month, I almost couldn't recognize her. When she saw me, her emotions were intense, and her eyes sparkled. She shouted loudly, "Martin." I calmly lifted my eyes, and the coldness in my gaze made her heart tighten. She couldn't finish her sentence, because the evidence I provided was sufficient. The court directly ruled that Elizabeth would leave the marriage with nothing. After Gabriel was arrested for tax evasion, he pushed all the responsibility for compensation onto Elizabeth. After hearing the court's decision, Elizabeth slumped down in her chair. Before leaving, I gave her one last cold look. Her face turned pale. As expected, she still called out to me, "Martin, can you not take that money? You know I can't come up with that much." The once proud Elizabeth had come to beg in such a low voice. I still remembered the first year after we got married. When she had an argument with a woman at a beauty salon simply because the woman accidentally stepped on her new shoes, she demanded a public apology and compensation. When I received her call, I bought the beauty salon as she had requested to back her up. Back then, I pampered Elizabeth to the extreme. Even when friends who knew about it said I was being unreasonable, I didn't care. All I thought about was how good Elizabeth was, and if she asked for anything, I would go to any lengths to give it to her. Even if she wanted the stars in the sky, I would find a way to get her a ladder. But now, when I heard her pleading, I didn't even want to look back. "Martin, please help me, can you?" Seeing that I didn't speak, she continued. I interrupted her. "Elizabeth, compared to the harm you've done to me over these years, this doesn't even matter." Her voice trembled as she defended herself. "Martin, I know I was wrong, horribly wrong, but I really love you. You have to believe me." At this point, I couldn't believe Elizabeth still used the word love to speak to me. How ironic. She had chosen to betray me because the men she had been hiding in her heart had returned. She pretended to love me now because she couldn't repay the money she owed me. I didn't know if there was anything Elizabeth wouldn't say or do. My heart sank to the bottom, and I shook my head with a sigh before walking straight out. Afterwards, I looked up at the clear sky and couldn't help but think, today, my 5-year marriage had finally come to an end. That night, Mario video called me after I arrived in Spain. He asked, "Do you regret it?" I knew what he meant. Fu Corporation was the legacy my parents left me, and my decision to withdraw from B-City was indeed a shocking one for everyone. But they were wrong. I didn't leave because of Elizabeth. My romantic mindset had awakened long ago. What I truly wanted was to make the legacy my parents left me better and ensure it would go further. 6 months later, I opened a new company in Spain. On the opening day, I saw Elizabeth in the crowd at the back. During these 6 months, Elizabeth hadn't repaid a single penny. I knew her ability had limits. I didn't push her. I always thought that having something was better than having nothing. Though Elizabeth hadn't repaid the full amount, I had to maintain some form of contact with her. Every time I received her transfer notification, I couldn't help but sigh. In the long passage of time, there are always 1 or 2 people who push you forward and force you to grow. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I didn't go to Elizabeth to greet her. At that moment, standing by my side was the daughter of my professor. She had been with me all this time, helping me get familiar with the streets of Spain. It was her who always showed up whenever I was discouraged, telling me to be brave. I remember that after many times I got drunk, she would say the same thing to me. "You have to believe. You're a good person." After the marriage with Elizabeth ended, I truly closed off my heart. When I thought I would live alone forever, she appeared just in time, bringing me a lot of joy. I naturally held her hand and, in front of everyone, knelt on one knee and pulled out a diamond ring. It was custom made by a niche designer she loved. A month ago, I promised her that I would give her an answer on the day the company opened, and I didn't want to go back on my word. I didn't want to lose a girl who thought only of me. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, and said, "I do." Elizabeth, standing behind the crowd, also had tears in her eyes. I knew she had been secretly checking my social media, but I couldn't give her any response. My job was to walk my future path more steadily and brilliantly. I embraced my new girlfriend with applause from everyone, whispering in her ear, "Thank you for appearing in my life." As soon as the words left my mouth, Elizabeth turned away, wiping her tears and leaving. This time, I couldn't even bring myself to say goodbye to her. I hope that, in the long course of time, we will never meet again.